Hello everyone, I wanted to present you with the final project I did for parametric product design in critical making this spring. I wanted to apply 3D printing to fabric in a way that was combining art and technology. So this was a new sphere for me. I had seen, traditional arts being in a separate sphere as technology, and so this was a very practical way of exploring the possibilities that a marriage of the two could offer. Parametric art installation, that's something that I wanted to look at a little closer. This term we had looked at parametric design as an idea, using pattern making or tessellation as a way to create a beautiful whole, working within the confines of certain parameters, and then seeing what can be created, what variations can be created within those confines. So I asked myself, how might I apply 3D printing to fabric such that the outcome is primarily aesthetic? That was another goal I had. I had very much entered the program with a practical mindset, and last term I had looked at applying 3D printing to a household product or to a handbag that carries things, not a handbag that is pretty, and I wanted to explore aesthetic just for aesthetic's sake. And so I treated this project very much like practicing tools of parametric design. So the concept was to print on fabric, or as you can see here, through fabric. And so I had the Ultimaker 3. I had a limited amount of fabric available to me, and I used Rhino and Grasshopper. I found a definition on YouTube that I could download for these tubes that I could then manipulate in terms of the wave and also the spiral effect. There were certain textures I could add on top. In this case, you see sort of a spiral with a hard edge. And then I wanted to practice these parametric design principles, as I had mentioned earlier. So my idea was to create almost like a patchwork. Here you see 6 squares of fabric that have, this line represents a printed tube, and then finding ways to bring these patches together. So using traditional principles of quilting, and then finding a way to apply 3D printing onto it. So these black parts are the seams. So the idea was to bring together the panels in an overlapping way that would mirror this effect of in and out or wavy. Then the installation would look much larger. I had this idea of adding a wooden piece on the top so that it could be hung from, not from a wall, but from the ceiling away from a wall. And the reason for that is because it's very much a 3D project, it could be viewed from both sides. It was a departure from the classical arts where you could quilt something and hang it on the wall, or make a rug and hang it on the wall, or paint something. This was something that could be viewed from all sides and really displayed the possibilities of 3D printing, parametric design, and fabric all together. I wanted to use a tube that meant something, and so I found the flat irons here, and I traced this front layer here, and it created a very interesting, also recognizable shape of the profile of the flat irons. I also found a topographical map so that I could, when you viewed it from the side, or in this case the top, you could see how the mountains moved from a top-down view. And then I applied that curve to a tube, and what was interesting there is that the tube was not faithfully following the curve, and I noticed I could manipulate this if I stretched out the initial profile of the flat irons. But in one of my models, it was 3,000 inches long, so then I realized I had to cut up the Rockies, and that's where the paneling came in. I had sections which then became not a grid pattern, all based on the Rockies here. And then when I was able to manipulate the thickness, I was able to find a tube that more faithfully followed that pattern. This project was all about iterations. I started 6 weeks ago with the concept of a tube that lay in between 2 bars, so that halfway through the print, when I paused the machine, I could overlay fabric and it wouldn't be draped over a base print, but it would be in line with these sidebars. We also thought to clamp down the fabric onto these sidebars. And within the first print, we realized that was a bad idea, because as soon as you clamp down onto the print bed, you change the dimension or the orientation that the extruder takes at the very beginning when it touches off. And suddenly when you clamp down the print bed, it's much lower than the computer thinks it is. And so it printed the second half of the tube in the air, and I had these weird spirals. So that was the first very important learning. Then I realized I didn't need those bars. I removed them. And I also found that the mesh was much more stiff than I expected it to be. I thought I'd have to put in boning in between the panels, which is this, traditionally it used to be whalebone that you'd insert into women's corsets. And so a corset, you could take it off and sit it on the table and it would stand upright. So I thought I'd need that stiffness to hold the installation up. But I noticed that it printed well, and it didn't need very much support. In fact, it would hang nicely on its own. The supports that were printed, they easily snapped off and didn't damage the fabric. In the third iteration, I looked at ways of joining the fabric. I had tried a traditional seam, which looked very much like the cuff of jeans, and that just looked ugly. And because of the transparency of mesh, it offered opportunities to even in the hem, do some nice movements. I also noticed that when the tube got thicker, to remove the supports tore the fabric. And so that's when the idea of using some PVA came in, so water-soluble supports, and then using a dual extrusion in the printer. So one half would be PLA, the plastic that you see, and the other half would be the PVA, which you dunk in water for 30 minutes and it would dissolve without damaging your fabric. So this was our final model, which I credit RJ to. The red panel is the fabric, and it intersects the three tubes, which represent the Rockies. And then in this screenshot, you see that I had taken the three parts of a tube, put a bounding box around it, and found a way to really go deep into the measurements. I had to measure the bottom of the bounding box to exactly where the fabric would intersect with it, and that measurement was important to put into Cura. So that we knew that the fabric would intersect at the exact same layer for all the 9 pieces, even if the tube looked different. So that when you assembled it, not only did the tube fit, but the fabric also lined up. We went into the G code and added a manual pause. So we added an M25 command, which would pause the printer for me and wait for me to restart it. It would give me time to overlay the fabric, make sure everything was good. So I wanted to talk about the good and the bad, because there's a few things. During a pandemic, I was limited in my supplies. I didn't have access to a fabric store. In fact, I had to use a Halloween costume, a cape, and so I had that black mesh, but a finite amount. Luckily, I didn't push up against that constraint. Would have been fine. I had lots of fabric. Access, I was lucky enough to have RJ available for all sorts of troubleshooting, even tech troubleshooting, texting in Lowe's saying, is this the nut that I need? And I also was lucky enough to have the 3D printer in my home. When the lab was sort of dissolved due to the pandemic, I got the printer, and I feel very thankful for that, because I was able to do a lot of iterations. And the truth about iterations is that it's kind of an experiment, and each experiment reveals a little more of the truth, a little more facts that you need to make your project work. And so luckily, because I had this printer, I could really learn a lot in an autodidactic way about what my seemingly simple project was. During this time, I also joined Make for COVID, and I was producing PPE equipment for frontline workers here in Colorado. So I produced headbands and then also buckles for masks. And as a result, if I wasn't iterating for my project, I was printing stuff for that effort. Limited time, everyone has limited time in a semester, but I also had 2 children that were out of school. And so the challenge there was that I couldn't go on as if business was usual. Be confined in the home gives the impression that there's nothing else to do but to work and to be focused on your things, but that was not my case. And the biggest hurdle was not iteration or discovering the intricacies of the code or figuring out the bounding boxes and the minute millimeters you needed, but was really that in the final week, during finals of the semester, the printer just was showing signs of needing maintenance, probably due to being in the lab for 2.5 years, probably because I was using a lot for Make for COVID. And as a result, I missed a deadline to present in class. And then rather than quickly get it done, I had 2 days of maintenance, and it really prevented me from moving from the concepting and modeling stage into the printing. And so that was a big letdown for me. It's a very detail-oriented process. I was joking with someone that tubes seem very easy to reproduce, especially if you download a grasshopper definition from somebody else. It's just a tube, and you can manipulate it. But there's much more to it than that. It's how does the fabric intersect? Then how do you get the panels to fit together? Then how do you get a pause in the G code? So there was quite a lot to explore there. It was new territory, certainly. 3D printing on fabric exists, but I wanted to see what it could be in terms of creative technology, not a physical, practical application, but very much tech meets quilting. It was also an anti-practical project, like I said. No pressure to perform in a particular way. I wasn't making a household product that was expected to function a certain way. I was doing this, you could almost say, without constraints, which is ironic, given that it's a parametric product, and there are definitely constraints. And I like this idea, again, of creative technology. It was something very new for me because I'd been trained in more traditional forms of art. I would treat this project as a prototype for a much larger installation. I really saw this as a huge thing that would span a room, and it kept getting smaller and smaller as the weeks went by. And in the end, I don't have a physical product to show, which gives me a very sour feeling in the end. But time has run out. Other people are waiting for the printer, and the semester is over. So I think that this is very much a prototype. At least conceptually, and can be used on a small scale to tweak and to not really tweak, but to learn about the medium. This is a printer, but how does it perform with fabric? And when does it gum up the extruder? And when does it shift? And I mean, we bought like a digital caliper to measure the fabric, but then we realized it was so negligible. And so these are all learnings that are very on the minute scale. And so I'm very happy that I had this chance to do it. So happy that I had so much time and access to tools. I feel very let down that I couldn't even print one strip and see how that would fit together. At this moment, at the very last day to hand this in, the printer is still not working, and I need to hand it off to my colleagues. There's still more maintenance to do. So all in all, I'm happy with the learnings at the very least, and with the conceptual takeaways from this project. So thank you very much.